Good day. There have recently been a number of strategically placed leaks in the Russian media, clearly sourced from the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Kremlin, which show that the Russians are in the process of conducting a comprehensive review of their relationship with the United States and are concluding that those relationships are probably, that relationship is probably not going further fast. Having said that, it also seems that the Russians are concluding that though there is little prospect of an improvement in relations between Washington and Moscow, probably the bottom in that relationship has now been reached. I say that because the first report, which I'm going to discuss, which appeared a few days ago in the Russian newspaper Kommersant, talks about the United States actually backtracking a little on the current anti-Russia campaign that is underway in Washington, or has been underway in Washington and in the United States for some time. This is what the Kommersant report says. The US administration is backtracking from the new scandal in the relations with Moscow after US President Joe Biden's interview with the ABC channel. Biden called on EU partners to take Russia into account and invited Vladimir Putin to participate in the virtual climate summit in April. For his part, US Ambassador to Russia John Sullivan says that he has no plans to leave Moscow. These signals do not go unnoticed in Russia. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov expressed some satisfaction over the fact that the US is entering a remission in Russophobic seizures. Thus, Moscow and Washington do not abandon dialogue on separate issues, with the corresponding channels still functioning. Having said that, the Russians have little actual expectation of a reboot anytime soon, and it seems that the Russian foreign ambassador in Washington, who was recalled to Moscow for detailed consultations as part of this review, is still going to stay there in Moscow for some time before he returns to Russia. This is what Vedomosti, another Russian newspaper, which, by the way, at one point was in partnership with Britain's Financial Times, this is what the Vedomosti reports, also on the basis of sources within Russia. The future of Russian-American ties under the Biden administration is rather clear. It is obvious that the US will not meet Russia halfway if Moscow decides to make concessions, since the administration in Washington is resolved to punish Moscow for allegedly swiping the 2016 election from the Democrats. Given these conditions, Russia should not respond to vague invitations of the US for dialogue. It should only do so when it directly corresponds to Moscow's interests. Now, as I discussed in a recent program for this channel, Vladimir Putin himself has said exactly the same thing, that the Russians will not discuss topics which the Americans want to talk about. They will only discuss topics with the Americans which the Russians themselves also want to talk about. And it seems that one of the topics that the Russians are disinclined to talk about is this climate summit that Joe Biden is trying to set up. Here again is what Vedomosti said about that. On March 26, the White House press service confirmed that Biden had invited Russian President Putin and Chinese President Xi to participate in the virtual climate summit scheduled for April 22nd, 23rd. The newspaper's diplomatic source thinks that there is no point for Russia to accept this invitation, since there will be attempts to prevent the Russian leader from addressing the summit or to downplay his participation as much as possible. So, it is unlikely that this summit will bring positive results to Russian-American relations. In other words, Putin is unlikely to go or to attend for the simple reason that his views will not be heeded, and it might indeed simply be the case that this summit will provide another opportunity for Western states to lecture him, which he is not in the mood to accept at the present time. Going back to the Kommersant article, we learn what sort of topics the Russians might be interested in discussing with the US, and the agenda appears to be a very different one from the sort of agenda that the Biden administration might be interested in. We will cooperate with the US only in areas that we need and that are of interest to us. Strategic stability, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the Arctic, Afghanistan, and so on. In case of the US, it's time we moved on to this principle. Notice that climate change and the pandemic are not amongst this list of items. I think the Russians probably would be interested in talking about the pandemic, but they're not going to engage in serious discussions about climate change, and I doubt that the Chinese will either. There is one further topic which the Russians are undoubtedly interested in talking about with the US, but it's most unlikely that the US will wish to discuss it with the Russians, and that's the issue of cybersecurity. Now, Putin, at a recent meeting of Russia's top decision-making body, the Security Council, one which, by the way, gets lamentably little notice or attention in the West, even though it is a body, Russia's cabinet, in effect Russia's cabinet, which meets once a week and where all major decisions are discussed. Anyway, Putin, at a recent meeting of this important body on 26 March 2021, set out Russia's views about the need for a cybersecurity and international cybersecurity treaty. Now, the Russians have some very interesting ideas on this topic, and Putin set them out in some detail. They are of a kind, however, which I am confident that the United States will never agree to accept. So these are the kind of things that we would like, that he's talking about, that Putin is talking about, and now I'm quoting his precise words. We must concentrate on developing mechanisms for cooperation in ensuring the security of the global information space. The scale for partnership in this respect is exceptionally broad. Exchange of experience and joint response to computer incidents, personal training, and research. And then he goes on to say, we support equality, order, and mutual respect of the cyberspace, as well as its progressive development. Of course, all interested parties should be able to join in developing this important agenda. It is important to jointly develop and agree on universal and fair for all views on the responsible behavior of states in the cyberspace with clear and easy to follow criteria for acceptable and unacceptable actions and to make these legally binding. In other words, each country must strictly follow these rules. We advocate the inviolability of the digital sovereignty of states. This means that each country can independently determine the variables for regulating its information space and the corresponding infrastructure. Now, the key words here are: we advocate the inviolability of the digital sovereignty of states. This is something the United States, in its present mood, is absolutely not prepared to accept. You may remember that a few weeks ago, I discussed on this channel, and I also discussed with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on the Duran, a bizarre threat which the United States made and which was published in no less a place than the New York Times, that the United States would carry out some form of cyber attack on Russia, which would be kept secret and concealed from the world, and that this would happen sometime over the course of the next 3 weeks. Well, those weeks have come and gone, and there's no information yet of such a cyber attack. And in fact, what we're hearing from the United States is that it is still in the process of carrying out this sort of a review. What we can say with some confidence is that the country which has carried out the most aggressive, or at least the most open cyber attacks, has not been Russia and it's not been China, it's been the United States. I say that, I'm not in any way disputing that the Russians and the Chinese have not carried out cyber espionage. In other words, they've hacked into US government information systems and perhaps even those of private companies and no doubt those of other states also. But this has been primarily and principally in order to obtain the secrets of those countries. In other words, it is a form of espionage. The United States, of course, engages that equally and does so on a far greater scale, as we know from Edward Snowden's revelations and from WikiLeaks' leak of the Vault 7 CIA material. So all countries do that, and it's unlikely, by the way, that this treaty that Putin is talking about is going to restrict that to any great extent, because cyber espionage, like all forms of espionage, is almost certain to continue exactly as before. It's not hacking of that kind that Putin is talking about. It is the use of cyber tools to carry out sabotage in other countries. And here, the country which we know was involved or has been involved in doing that is the United States. There was the Stuxnet virus that was inserted into Iran's nuclear program more than 10 years ago, and which did real damage to that program, which was the work, as has been unofficially admitted, of the United States and Israel. And of course, we've had these comments coming out of Washington over the last few weeks about a cyber attack, a possible cyber attack on Russia. And in the last weeks of the Obama administration, we also learned, thanks to the Washington Post on that occasion, that the United States had planted or was intending to plant various cyber bombs, as they were called, in Russia's national infrastructure. That is the sort of thing that this treaty that Putin is proposing is partly intended to outlaw. It's also the case that, of course, Putin is concerned about information flows. And this is what he means when he talks about the inviolability of the digital sovereignty of states. This means, and I'm quoting from him again, that each country can independently determine the variables for regulating its information space and the corresponding infrastructure. What Putin is talking about here is the enormous global reach of US tech companies and social media companies like Twitter and Facebook, and the way Putin and some other world leaders perceive these companies as promoting US geopolitical interests. A number of examples will suffice. It's well known that Twitter, for example, was involved in helping a uprising that took place in Moldova in 2009, which overthrew a pro-Russian government there. Twitter was also heavily involved in the uprising in Tahrir Square in Cairo, which led to the fall of President Mubarak. And of course, there have been many other instances of US social media companies being used in order to mobilize opposition in particular countries to governments that the US has problems with. The Russians are known to have been particularly incensed by the way some US media companies, including Google, Twitter, and Facebook, participated or were seen to participate in the recent protests which took place in Russia, connected to the jailing of the Russian dissident blogger and politician Alexei Navalny. What Putin is saying is that there should be an international treaty which will regulate this kind of activity and which will allow countries like Russia and other countries also to regulate their own social media environment and prevent this sort of thing in future from taking place. The United States will, of course, resist that, because up to now, it is the United States which has dominated the social media environment, and the United States sees social media as an instrument of its soft power and of its geopolitical reach. So, for the moment, it's most unlikely that the US will agree to these ideas that Putin and the Russians are floating about cybersecurity. I would add that Putin's comments about cybersecurity are not new. The Russians float this idea for an international cybersecurity treaty every few years, and recent events have simply given them yet another opportunity to do so. I anticipate that the Chinese, before very long, seeing the way Twitter and other social media companies participated in the protests in Hong Kong, will be joining the Russians in this, and we might see other countries doing so also. So, though the United States is likely to oppose these ideas coming from the Russians for the moment, it may be that at some point things will begin to change. I'm going to say something about this, which is that, in my opinion, the days of US domination of social media, and indeed of cyberspace generally, are starting to fade. Because the internet was originally an American thing, because the software and indeed the hardware was developed in the United States, and because the big social media companies are American, it has been the case for a very long time that the United States has been able to dominate social media and new technologies to an extent that no other country, except to some extent China, has been able to do. One reason, by the way, why it has been possible for agencies like the NSA in the United States to carry out bulk surveillance, to the extent that the NSA does is precisely because it is working through technologies in social media companies and on cyberspace, which are ultimately American. The Russians simply do not have that kind of advantage. But the situation is changing. China is already a major producer of its own hardware. It already produces its own chips on a massive scale, even though these are not as advanced as those produced in places like Taiwan and South Korea. And of course, it has its own social media companies, its own Great Wall, its own software. And its digital environment is actually greater in scale than that of the US itself. The Russians are far behind, but they are starting to make progress in moving in the same direction. Over the last few years, there's been a revival in the Russian semiconductor industry, with the focus being Russia's giant Rostec corporation, which fulfills in Russia some of the same role that Samsung does in Korea. One of Rostec's subsidiaries, Elbrus, now makes semiconductors and chips, and apparently these are fairly advanced, though the manufacturing process is still somewhat old-fashioned and certainly needs updating. Nonetheless, these Russian-made chips are apparently now being used increasingly in Russia's military industries and technologies, and and have also been applied in developing Russian supercomputers. Undoubtedly, this is a matter to which the Russians are giving priority, and like the Chinese, I am sure that they will be working hard to upgrade the manufacturing technology of their chip producers so as to produce chips that at least approach and perhaps even equal those that are produced in places like Taiwan and South Korea. Both the Chinese and the Russians certainly have both the resources and the technical means to do that. And of course, the Russians have their own social media companies, which are much talked about, companies like Telegram, Vkontakte, and the rest, and no doubt, and Yandex, and no doubt they will be developing more. They're also heavily involved in developing their own software, and they're starting to insist that more companies, Russian companies, convert from US software or US origin software to Russian software. There's recently been a spat between the Russian government and Gazprom, with the government insisting that Gazprom convert fully to Russian software, and Gazprom asking for more time in which to do that because of the cost of doing it, and being told by the Russian government that it must do it right away, or at least as soon as possible, regardless, in effect, of cost. There's even been proposals from Rostec to set up rival operating systems, different from American systems like Windows and the Apple and the ones used by Apple, and so that these can be produced on Russian PCs and computers, which are apparently to come. And I'm sure that the Chinese are doing the same. So the days of US dominance in this area, in this field, are waning. And perhaps in light of that, the day may one day come when the US, finding itself as vulnerable to cyber warfare as other countries, might be more receptive to the kind of cyber treaty that the Russians are floating at this time. However, that remains something that will happen I think, not in the not very immediate future. The overall story is of two countries, the United States and Russia, where relations now are being conducted at an almost minimal level. The Russians have concluded that there is no point in pursuing a major strategic dialogue with the Biden administration. They're going to talk to the Biden administration on those topics which concern them: Afghanistan, arms control, the Arctic, cybersecurity, if they can get the US to listen to them, and obviously the situation in the Middle East and those sort of things. But active dialogue on the kind of ideas and policies that the US is interested in, the Russians will no longer be willing to discuss them to the extent that the US wants. Talk about climate change, to which the Russians give far less priority, the US may find that when it approaches the Russians on that, they will be on stony ground. The same, I suspect, will be on topics like Iran's nuclear program. We are now in a situation where the US and Russia have lost all illusions about each other. We're not in a Cold War situation exactly. We are instead in what I would describe as a state of cold peace. Any idea that the US or Russia relations are going to change in the short term is being discounted in Moscow. And even if there is a shift in perspective about this in Washington, I don't think it will find the Russians at all receptive. From now on, the Russians are going to conduct their relationship with the United States at minimal levels as they forge ahead in improving their relations with their key ally, which is from now on China and not the US. Thank you for joining me for this program. I hope you can join me in future programs, both on this channel and on others. Please also join me on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out his channel and also our new channel where we show our interactions with our viewers. You will find links to all these channels under this video. Please also look us up on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. Please also, to the extent that you can, support us on through PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Remember, we accept donations in things like Bitcoin and other such currencies. And last but not least, check out our shop, see the wonderful things we have there, our famous magic mugs, the best magic mugs in the world, our hats, our t-shirts, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, all those wonderful things. You support this channel and our other channels by coming to our shop, and you'll be delighted by the high quality of the things you find there. Last but not least, please also check our Discord server, and also please make sure that you're subscribed to this channel and to our other channels. Thank you for joining me today, and have a wonderful day.